My name's Alan Torrance. I'm Professor of Systematic Theology here in St Andrews and Director of the LOGOS Institute. And I'd like to start just by issuing a very warm welcome on this chilly quasi-summer day to the LOGOS conference and indeed to this ancient university. Just a few words about the university, because some of you I know are new to St Andrews. It's Scotland's oldest university, and indeed the third oldest university in the English-speaking world, after Oxford and Cambridge. On the opposite side of this quad, you'll see St Salvator's Chapel, and part of which was built 600 years ago, just shortly after the foundation of the university. There's a slight argument about the date of the foundation of the university, but it was constituted by the issue of a papal bull in 1413. Now, and theology has been taught really from the start. In 1418, a college of theology was founded, St John's College, and so for over 600 years, theological debate and discussion has taken place here. Now, I hope those of you who are not familiar with St Andrews will take the opportunity to explore and learn a little bit about the remarkable history of this town. Now, if you do, you'll discover that some of this history is rather sobering, given that it is peppered with atrocities perpetrated in the name of the church and Christian theology. If you entered the quad from the southeast side, you may have noticed a monogram set into the paving just outside the gate. This marks the spot where the Scottish reformer Patrick Hamilton was burned at the stake in 1528 for maintaining the truth of Melanchthon's Loci Communes. Alexander Elasius, who was converted partly by witnessing his courage during that burning, commented that the execution took place on wood that was damp, and that he wasn't actually burned to death, but roasted to death over a long, torturous period of time. Now, I should add, and this is important to emphasize, that both sides of the ecclesiastical divide were victims of theological suspicion, anger, and hatred, odium theologicum, and both sides were perpetrators of its worst expressions and excesses. Now, happily, such ecclesial hostility has long gone, and a very brief look at the affiliations of the Faculty of Divinity here, I had to do this yesterday, suggests that roughly a third of my colleagues are approximately Roman Catholic. Another third are roughly Anglican, Episcopal, and quasi-Episcopal. And the other third is a very happy band of Presbyterians, Baptists, heretics, and agnostics. We all pull together most effectively, and the only roasting that takes place is the annual St Mary's barbecue. Now, despite all this, another form of theological division and polarization has emerged within our universities, and that concerns the divisions along disciplinary lines that academia very understandably encourages. We now have a situation where biblical scholars engage primarily with other biblical scholars, theologians, like myself, with other theologians, and philosophers with philosophers, even when their research fields obviously and necessarily overlap, not least when it comes to engaging with fundamental Christian truth claims. But sadly, this cancer is spread within the disciplines themselves, and within theology, far too often we find a fragmentation where Thomists or Augustinians, Calvinists, Neo-Calvinists, liberal Protestants, Barthians, Catholic modernists withdraw into subgroups or echo chambers, which allow us all too easily to avoid the fundamental questions that we really ought to be addressing. The Logos Institute was established 4 years ago, prompted by a series of convictions. First, this academic or quasi-academic compartmentalization is unlikely to serve effectively either the academy or indeed the 2.6 billion Christians worldwide. It's unlikely to address the theological divisions that so tragically characterize the Christian community and undermine its witness. Nor indeed does it serve well those outside the Christian faith who seek to understand what this faith tradition is all about. In short, these divisions are a distraction, a diversion from the kind of rigorous intellectual engagement with the fundamental truth questions that is precisely what the academy, the universitas, should be about. That is, what precisely do the defining claims that characterize our faith traditions mean? What do they mean? Are they cogent? Are they warranted by their sources? Are they true? And if they are true, what are the conditions under which we recognize and affirm these to be true? In order to address these fundamental questions, there's a shared conviction amongst all of those involved in Logos Institute, and indeed, of course, many outside, that the pursuit of the truth question is best served by bringing our leading biblical scholars, those with expertise in philosophical theology, metaphysics, and epistemology, into serious, constructive discussion and dialogue with theologians, so that these truth questions might be analyzed and engaged in rigorously transparent and accountable ways. That is, in a manner that invites open and honest critical reflection and assessment. That's the vision that drives the programs and the research in the Logos Institute, and it's just been a joy and a privilege to be part of that over the last 4 years. Now, this vision didn't come from nowhere. It was the consequence of a series of remarkable developments that have taken place in recent decades, and most of you will be familiar with all of this. The most significant of these was the sea change, is the sea change that has taken place within analytic philosophy and philosophical theology. 40 years ago, when I spent 4 years studying philosophy, theism had such low epistemic status that the philosophical within the philosophical community, that you would have been met with derision, roasted, if you had suggested that theism had unique explanatory power, or that you wanted to introduce engagement with the God question into philosophical discussion. You could count, as I've often said, you could count the number of non-closet Christian philosophers on the fingers of a mutilated hand. Due, however, to the just really astonishing courage and intellectual rigor of a really small group of Christian philosophers. Alpantiga, Nicholas Watersdorf, Bill Austin, and then a group from a slightly younger generation, Eleonore Stump, Peter van Inwagen, and Marilyn McCord Adams, and others. This whole situation has changed. Depending on who you believe, it's now the case that between 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 academic philosophers are theists. The majority of them are committed Christians. The knock-on effect of this has been the emergence of 7 new refereed journals, literally numerous monographs published by leading academic presses, and literally thousands of articles in refereed journals by philosophical theologians engaging theological issues, questions central to the Jewish and Christian faith traditions. I could add Islamic, actually. Islamic, Jewish, and Christian faith traditions. The effect has been massively to raise the game in the academic engagement with the truth questions central to these traditions. It was in response to this, of course, that Mike Ray and Oliver Crisp led the way in establishing analytic theology, where theology is undertaken in a manner that exhibits the methodological ideals and intellectual commitments that characterize analytic philosophy. But that wasn't the only development that's significant. A further polarization that has characterized academia is the division between systematic theology and biblical studies. And another defining development over the last 3 decades has been the extent to which this has been challenged. Leading biblical scholars, like my two St Andrews colleagues, Richard Bauckham and N.T. Wright, have, along with other colleagues in Cambridge, Oxford, Duke and elsewhere, been challenging this division of labour in really constructive ways. The engagement with biblical scholarship is of critical importance to pursuing these truth questions, not least because the immense intellectual rigour of the analytic philosophical theologians too often operates on the basis of suppositions about the biblical sources that are naive and insufficiently informed by profoundly relevant developments in those fields. There's no point in having really sustained, rigorous argument based on dodgy premises. Now, there are 2 other people here at this conference who have also played a significant part in inspiring the vision that we are seeking to promulgate, and I just want to mention these briefly. During the zenith, or was it the nadir, of secularization in the 1970s, when Bultmann's demythologization and the authors of The Myth of God Incarnate were defining the theological debate, Professor Jürgen Moltmann had the courage, again, totally against the stream of theological scholarship, to write a book that placed the incarnation at the very center of the theological task, exploring the light that this sheds on fundamental challenges to the Christian faith. Still further, he highlighted how critically important it was for Christian theologians to engage Jewish theological insight. And by the way, if anyone still has any doubt about the importance of that, they must have missed Amy Jill Levine's tour de force yesterday afternoon. Jürgen Moltmann also established that it's not possible for theologians to think hard about the kingdom of God and not engage the challenges of oppression and marginalization. The impact of that one man on the theological debate has just been unquantifiable. It's a privilege to have him right here. Especially, I hope you don't mind me saying this, given that 4 weeks ago, he was very seriously ill. His heart stopped for 2 minutes, and as he put it to me yesterday, he had to be resurrected from the dead. So, anyway, it's a privilege to have you here, sir. Finally, and I'm running too long. Well, just nearly finished. Finally, in the 1980s, Colin Gunton and Christoph Schwöbel, who's also here, established a research institute in systematic theology in King's College London that played a major role in redefining the whole thrust and direction of theology in this country. That institute brought philosophers, theologians, and biblical scholars together to engage with key doctrinal questions in a manner that was rigorously informed by all 3 disciplines. I had the privilege of being involved in that institute. As a result of Christoph's and Colin's work, a whole generation of doctoral students and colleagues enjoyed the unforgettable privilege of participating every Tuesday in a seminar where Paul Helm, New Testament scholars Francis Watson and Graham Stanton, and a raft of theologians and indeed theological ethicists came together to for what we used to refer to as bear pit brawls, like really lively but constructive theological engagement with fundamental truth claims. And participants in that seminar included a very young Oliver Crisp, who, of course, has just joined the Logos Institute as full-time here as Professor of Analytic Theology. That is just spectacularly good news, a real coup. Now, of course, this vision was not unique to King's College London. Sarah Coakley has exemplified that same triangular conversation and commitments in Harvard and in Cambridge. These are some of the factors that establish the vision which the Logos Institute is seeking both to embody, but also to disseminate. And it's a particular privilege to have so many of those who have been central to forming this vision with us and engaging on the doctrine of reconciliation. You may have noticed we have 6 Gifford lecturers, no less than 6 Gifford lecturers participating in this conference. And just finally, the fact that this is taking place in St Andrews and not in Birmingham, where we originally intended to establish this, is due to Louise Richardson, formerly principal of this university and now the first ever woman Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University. And she made a personal commitment to establish this here in St Andrews, and so we are massively in her debt. And she will be giving the after-dinner address at the dinner tomorrow. One final comment I'd just like to make: an unexpected privilege of working within the Logos Institute has been a spin-off of analytic theology. The commitment to transparency, accountability, and engaging arguments has impacted the character of the discussions I've witnessed. Discussions in Logos have been almost entirely free of the kind of smirking, the eyeball rolling, and all those other forms of subtle harassment and bullying that far too often characterize theological discussion and debate. Analytic theology fosters a commitment to genuine mutual respect, to hear arguments from those who take different approaches, and to address argument with argument in ways that is respectful of the dignity of the person who's presented them. And in continuity with this, just a brief tribute to Mike Ray, who's tragically not here, Mike Ray has gone to remarkable lengths to expand the conversation within analytic theology to ensure a radically inclusive context of theological engagement in which minority groups are not just present, but really heard. In sum, the vision includes forms of engagement that are free from the kinds of insecurity-led polarization and odium theologicum that the history of this town so shamefully portrays. There wouldn't be a conference were it not for the astonishing efficiency and selfless hard work of Diana Verhagen at the back of the room. We'll express our gratitude formally later, but I couldn't wait to say something now. She just deserves all the heart thanks she can possibly get. And I should also thank my son Andrew, who is acting director of Logos. I'm actually technically away this year, and he has covered every base supremely well. I'll now hand over to our new Professor of Analytic Theology, Oliver Crisp, to chair the opening session. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Welcome, everyone, to the conference. It's my job to chair the session. Let me just say one or two things, then I'll introduce the speakers and we'll just get straight into it. In your packs that you picked up when you registered, you should have a handout that you will want to look at for the session that we're doing now, because that handout is an outline of Professor Stump's lecture. So you might want to take that out of your bag as we begin. We'll be going till 11, or just after 11 o'clock, when we'll have a coffee break. The coffee is where you registered, directly below us. So when we finish, please just file downstairs for coffee, and we'll have a coffee break for about half an hour before we come back up here for the second session with Professor Moltmann. Well, it's my privilege and delight to be able to introduce to you this morning our first plenary speaker, who's already been mentioned in Professor Torrance's comments, Professor Eleanor Stump, who's the Robert J. Henley Chair of Philosophy in St. Louis University in Missouri, where she's taught since 1992. Professor Stump has a background in classical languages and also an MA in Biblical Studies from Harvard, but she ended up studying medieval matters at Cornell University, where she did her MA and PhD. She's taught in a number of different institutions, including Oberlin College and the University of Notre Dame, and has given a number of distinguished lecture series, including the Wilde Lectures at Oxford, the Gifford Lectures at Aberdeen, the Stewart Lectures at Princeton, and most recently, last year, the Stanton Lectures in Cambridge. In 2013, the American Catholic Association awarded her the Aquinas Medal for her work, and as many of you will know, she's very much an Aquinas scholar. She's a past president of the Society for Christian Philosophers, of the Central American Philosophical Association Division, of the American Catholic Philosophical Association, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I'm sure everybody here is aware of her work, which has been extremely influential in philosophy of religion and in analytic theology. But some of the major works that she's written in the last few decades include her monumental work on Aquinas and her work Wandering in Darkness, as well as most recently in the Oxford Studies in Analytic Theology series, her huge tome on the Atonement, which came out last year. In addition to all these many achievements and honors and distinguished things that she's done, she's an honorary professor here at the Logos Institute. So we are very delighted to have Professor Stump with us. She's going to come and talk to us about life in grace and union with God, Aquinas, and justification. But before you clap, let me just also introduce our respondent. Our respondent is Dr. Jonathan Rutledge. One doctorate is never enough. So Dr. Rutledge decided he would get a doctorate in philosophy from Oklahoma and a doctorate in divinity here from St. Andrews, where he's currently a research fellow in theology at the Logos Institute. He's working on issues pertaining to divine human reconciliation, in which he did his second PhD, as well as in epistemology and philosophy of religion. He oversees, some of you will have visited the website, the LOGOS website, where we've got some podcasts and there are blog posts and so on. And he's been instrumental in setting that up and maintaining it. And he's published in a number of major journals, including Religious Studies, Modern Theology, Faith and Philosophy, the Journal of Analytic Theology, the International Journal of Philosophy of Religion, and many others. So he will be responding to Professor Stump. And the format will be as follows. Professor Stump will come up and give her talk, and then Dr. Rutledge will come up and give his response, followed by a short further response by Professor Stump to her respondent, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. In order to save time, I won't be introducing each part of what's going on. I'm just telling you that now. So Professor Stump will come and talk first, and then Dr. Rutledge will come up after her. But please do join me now in welcoming Professor Eleanor Stump.
So I'm grateful to Professor Alan Torrance for that truly marvelous historical beginning to this conference. I hope somebody publishes that so we don't lose any of it. And I'm grateful to Professor Oliver Crisp for that generous introduction also. I'm very pleased to be here. I appreciate Diana's work for this conference too, and I'm looking forward to a very successful conference with all of you. Discussions of the problem of evil often focus on the many evils of the world: warfare, terrorism, oppression, poverty, racism, sexism, cruelty to beasts, destruction of the earth, and on in an interminable, depressing list of depredations against whatever is vulnerable. They focus on these issues in order to raise questions about the existence of a perfectly good, omniscient, omnipotent God. But another thing to wonder at is the moral evil of human beings, who in all cultures and all ages can be so vicious to one another and so destructive of the good of the rest of creation. In fact, people not only will what is morally wrong, they cling tenaciously to the moral wrong they will. They not only fail to will the good, they also fail to will it. They lack, or what is more nearly true, they reject a will for integration around the morally good. They lack this morally good will, not in the way in which a person lacks a limb by some accident external to the will. They lack it in the way in which a miserable person lacks a reform in his self-destructive habits, by resistance to such integration on the part of a person's own internally divided will. On traditional Christian views, alleviating the psychic fragmentation stemming from this post-fall human propensity to moral evil is necessary. It's necessary for living a life in grace and coming into union with God. But how is this problem in the post-fall human will to be remedied? In this lecture, I want to present Aquinas' answer to this question, at least as it affects a person's justification, which begins the process of coming into harmony with a perfectly good God. That's a sophisticated and promising answer in my view, but it also highlights a theologically significant puzzle. So I'm going to spend the entire time I have for the lecture, the brief time I have, laying out Aquinas' account, but then at the end I will just show you where the puzzle lies and we can talk about it some more in discussion if you want to. In the Christian theological tradition to which Aquinas belongs, justification or its equivalent is the technical term for moral and spiritual regeneration. Although such regeneration is a theological matter for Aquinas, the phenomenon or its secular analog is common and commonly recognized in our familiarity, for example, with the practices of Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. Talking about the recovery from alcoholism as AA understands it, the philosopher Norman Kerr says this. He says, there are cases in which a person has apparently altered his or her character, and other cases in which, despite strenuous effort, change was not realized. I won't clue you to the handout, but these quotations are all on the handout in your packet. Kerr says, I do not mean to suggest that parts of character are determined in any sense that's interesting for philosophy. I mean rather that there are aspects of character that are so salient in one's makeup, so fixed as a matter of practical fact, that the prospect of changing them is tantamount to the prospect of changing one's identity at the deepest level. This change of identity at the deepest level, as Kerr puts it, is a kind of rebirth. Speaking of the pain afflicting those who haven't experienced such regeneration, Kerr says this. He says, when my past is seen to be flawed, it contains wrongdoing by me, and amends are not feasible, in some cases not even possible, peace of mind is pushed out of reach. It may be that some people are able to meet the conditions of the backward-looking index of peace of mind. But when that backward-looking index is misused, people may be left without peace of mind, insofar as their lives come to be flawed via contingencies grounded in factors over which their control is nil or at least controversial. In certain cases, a person may suffer a deep loss of peace of mind involving the pain not only of bad feeling over particular actions, but also of distress over the kind of person he or she apparently is. In such cases, the problems of recovery, of going on with one's life, can be formidable. In a description that could, in my view, fit any human life at one time or another, Kerr says about people who are alcoholics in such an unregenerate condition, he says, the lives of many of us turn out to have in them very problematic parts, whose survey we are unable to bear. And then, insofar as our lives contain these problematic parts, we are left with the worry, the suspicion, that we do not fit the conceptions of ourselves by which we mean to govern ourselves. The human condition is such that many of us are or will be condemned by our past to be without peace of mind. As Kerr describes it, the change of practical or psychological identity which alters the elements of character that a person had previously felt helpless to reform is the sort of regeneration which justification initiates on Aquinas' account of justification. We can begin unraveling the complications of the theological understanding of justification by considering the nature of faith and its role in justification, because on Aquinas' views, a person's moral and spiritual regeneration begins with faith on her part. For Aquinas, a person is justified by faith alone, in the sense that the whole subsequent process of remedying the post-fall human condition will ultimately bring a person to full union with God in heaven, provided only that she has faith and continues in it. For Aquinas, faith is formed in a person who has surrendered resistance to God. That faith includes an act of will in which a person hates the evil in himself, yearns for the goodness that is God's, and accepts God's help and love. The act of will in faith thus consists in a higher order desire for a will that does not will evil but wills the good instead. And it includes a willingness to accept God's help to one degree or another in making one's own the goodness the person longs for. The will of faith is therefore a global second-order will to have, through God's help, a will that wills the good. A person who has formed this will of faith is in a state of justification. It's important to add here that the global second-order will of faith is compatible with any amount of first-order willing and even second-order willing of particular evils, provided that that willing doesn't destroy the second-order desire of faith. So, for example, a person might have that global second-order will of faith, and she might also believe that becoming vegetarian is morally obligatory for being a good person. But she might also have a second-order will for a will to eat meat on the grounds that the reform in her eating habits would be too strenuous for her at this time, given the current stress in her life, and so on with depressing familiarity. This condition is, of course, one way of being divided against oneself. By itself, then, justification only begins the process of integration around the good. It doesn't complete it. A person's forming the justifying global second-order desire for a will that wills the good starts the process of moral and spiritual regeneration in her, but sanctification is the process that completes it. In sanctification, God works together with that enduring global second-order will of faith in a cooperative enterprise that gradually integrates a person in goodness. And so Aquinas thinks that a person's global second-order will, that a person's justification is inevitably followed by her sanctification if only she perseveres in the global second-order will of the act of faith. That's because Aquinas believes that God loves all human persons. And so on Aquinas' account of love, God desires the good for every human person and desires to draw every human person into union with God. As long as a person does not resist God's help and grace, God's desires of love for her will be efficacious and will produce increasing goodness in her. For this reason, as long as she retains a second-order will for a will that wills the good, she will eventually have what she herself wants, namely a will entirely integrated in goodness. Given this necessarily exceedingly brief exposition of justification, we can profitably turn to the vexed question, where does justification's higher order desire for a will that wills the good come from? How does it originate? We might suppose, if we were naive enough, we might suppose that it originates, like any other desire, in the will of the person who forms that desire. But as I expect you all know, from Augustine's time onward, for philosophical and theological reasons, the tradition of thought Aquinas inherited rejected that answer. It's not possible to review that history in passing here, but the basic idea behind it is not hard to understand. If what needs to be explained is the ultimate origin of a moral and spiritual rebirth, then it's hard to see how it could be explained as a function of the will of the person whose moral and spiritual regeneration it is. Any will that wants to will the good is already in the process of such regeneration. The impetus for regeneration therefore has to come from without. It is Aquinas' position, which he inherits from Christian tradition long established by his time, that a human person's global second-order desire for a will that wills the good is both free and also produced in her by God's action on her will. And here I need to say that, as I have argued in great detail elsewhere, Aquinas holds a libertarian view of free will, which of course makes this discussion harder. As these claims make clear, Aquinas is not a Pelagian. Roughly construed, Pelagianism is the thesis that there can be some good of any kind in a human will that is not provided directly or indirectly by God's grace. The rejection of Pelagianism therefore includes the view that God's help, God's grace infused into a person is necessary for a person's moral goodness. She can't produce it in herself by herself. On Aquinas' views, before the beginning of the regeneration that is justification, a person has a resistance to forming the second-order desire in which she repudiates her own evil and desires God's goodness. Although the providence of God works in ways to shepherd her towards giving up that resistance. If in consequence of that shepherding, she gives up her resistance and her will becomes quiescent, then at that point, God puts grace into her will. Because of that divinely given grace, her will then forms the global higher order desire that is the will of faith. Because the scholastic prose in which the anti-Pelagianism of Aquinas' account is described is bloodless, it may help in understanding to return to the analogous case of Alcoholics Anonymous and look at its, as it were, anti-Pelagianism. Defending AA's anti-Pelagianism, Norman Kerr argues that there may be fixed elements of character which a person cannot alter in herself. So he puts the anti-Pelagian point this way. He says, people may be stuck with elements of character that they cannot budge, even despite strenuous effort. People may be powerless over themselves in certain respects. Our psyches are fragile in ways that show up in our failings to meet the sometimes interestingly different and sometimes conflicting terms of how persons are given by the variety of conceptions associated with the practices, institutions, ideologies, and general theories that structure our common life. And these failings are sometimes traceable to elements over which our control is nil, or at least controversial. As Kerr sees it, he says, some, maybe many of us, suffer constitution-affecting luck that places us outside the mainstream model of the in-control agent. What is meant here by saying that inclination, capacity, and temperament are matters of luck is that these elements of the self are the built-ins of my nature. As such, they are considered to be prior to the power of my will as expressed in my choices. These luck factors form, he says in a phrase I borrow from Frankfurt, these luck factors form necessities of the will. On Kerr's analog to anti-Pelagianism, the elements of character bequeathed a person by constitutional luck are, he says, not present to one's will as an item to be challenged. They are instead in one's will and structure one's moral, emotional psychology. For Kerr, for Aquinas, for all resolutely anti-Pelagian views, The principle that ought implies can is false. On Aquinas' views, a human person ought to will only good, but an unaided post-fall human will is unable to form even the first volition of moral regeneration, the will for a will that wills the good, not because something external to the will forbids it, but because the will itself resists it. On Aquinas' optimistic view of human life, however, there is a principle which is similar to the false principle that ought implies can, and which is not false but true. That's the principle that ought implies can with help. This principle is not a self-help principle. It's not a semi-Pelagian principle that attributes to a post-fall person the ability to will the beginning of her own moral regeneration. Rather, on Aquinas' view, the help in question is God's aid to the will, enabling the will to accept God's grace. All that is required of a human person to enable that aid to flow to her is that she cease resisting it, in a move that is not an act of will at all, but only a surrender, a ceasing, an omission of an act of will of resistance. It may help here to notice that the famous 12 steps and 12 promises of AA have a similar view. Care's moving and painfully honest description of his own experiences as an alcoholic make the point. Care describes an alcoholic life this way. He says, the characterization of its phenomenology requires not the terminology of disease or genetics, but such heavy moral psychological words as isolation, despair, worthlessness, and the classic triad, anger, resentment, and fear, as well as the negative staples of guilt, shame, regret, and remorse. This is the condition the alcoholic is in, and from which the AA program proposes the possibility of relief. And Care comments, AA recognizes what friends, family, and well-wishers may not be able to recognize, namely that recovery is not simple, quick, or easy. The first two of the 12 steps of AA are generally well known, and as Care quotes them, they are these. 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Commenting on the beginning of the process of the regeneration promised by AA, Care says, and this is the important point, Care says, no one gains the sobriety cum serenity an alcoholic seeks just by learning and knowing the 12 steps. Step 1 is a surrender of a certain sort. The 12 promises of AA are less well known, but they're worth mentioning in this connection too. I list only 3 of them here, the first, the fourth, and the last, and I give them as Care quotes them. 1, we're going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. 2, we will know peace. And 3, we will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. In this connection, I think it's also helpful to consider the description given by the founder of AA, Bill Wilson, of life before the surrender that begins the process of recovery. And I take this as quoted by Care also. Although Wilson's description of the life before surrender is meant to single out the life of an alcoholic especially painful, something like this pain and something like this moral bankruptcy afflicts all human beings in the post-fall human condition on the views shared by Aquinas with the rest of the Christian tradition. And the hope promised not to a person who is a cured alcoholic, but rather to a person who will live his whole life as a recovering alcoholic, that promise is relevantly similar to the hope promised to a person who will live his whole life in grace as both faithful and repentant. Wilson says about the alcoholic before the surrender that begins recovery, he says, no other kind of bankruptcy is like this one. Alcohol, now become the rapacious creditor, bleeds us of all self-sufficiency and all will to resist its demands. Once this stark fact is accepted, our bankruptcy as going human concerns is complete. And this is what Wilson says about the alcoholic in recovery in his comment on the last of the 12 steps, which says that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. Wilson says, our 12th step says that as a result of practicing all the steps, we have each found something called a spiritual awakening. To a new member of AA, this often seems like a very dubious and improbable state of affairs. They ask, what do you mean when you talk about a spiritual awakening? Maybe there are as many definitions of spiritual awakening as there are people who have had them, but certainly each genuine one has something in common with all the others. And these things which they have in common are not too hard to understand. When a man or a woman has a spiritual awakening, the most important meaning of it is that he has now become able to do, to feel, to believe that which he could not do before on his unaided strength and resources alone. He has been granted a gift which amounts to a new state of consciousness and being. He has been set on a path which tells him he is really going somewhere, that his life is not a dead end, not something to be endured or something to be mastered. In a very real sense, he has been transformed because he has laid hold of a source of strength which he had in one way or another hitherto denied himself. He finds himself in possession of a degree of honesty, tolerance, unselfishness, peace of mind, and love, of which he had thought himself quite incapable. What he has received is a free gift, and yet, usually, at least in some small part, he has made himself ready to receive it. The process and the hope offered by Alcoholics Anonymous, as sketched in these words, are analogous to the process and hope offered by the theological doctrine of justification, with this one caveat, that the active-sounding last phrase, he has made himself ready to receive it, would, on Aquinas' views, be better put in more passive terms. Aquinas would say, as Norman Kerr also says in his own description of this state of affairs, Aquinas would say that such a person has surrendered to God's love. On Aquinas' anti-Pelagian views, then, surrender on the part of a person enables her justification. In justification, she abandons the attempt to use her own strength of will, to make her will be what she wants her will to be. Instead, she accepts her need for help. Rather than struggling for what she wants to be, she lets go of the struggle. She surrenders to God's love and grace. And the result is a strengthening of her will and a concomitant increase in her integration around the good. These good things stem from God's action on her will. They do not stem from her own efforts. But it is nonetheless her own will that is ultimately responsible for the strengthened state of her will. Whether or not she surrenders to God is up to her. And consequently, it is also up to her whether or not she comes to be integrated around the good in the way necessary for being in harmony with God. So a life in grace and union with God begins with a surrender to God on Aquinas' views and God's love on the part of a person as that person comes to faith. In this process, she moves from the state of resisting God's grace, however tacitly or covertly, she moves from that state to quiescence, the cessation of resistance. In doing so, she surrenders to God by letting go of activity in the will entirely where grace is concerned. And once her will is quiescent, then God can regenerate her will without compelling it or breaking it. At that point, God infuses grace, and that grace moves her to the will of faith, to repudiating her own evil and longing for God's goodness. So God instills into her at that point a global second-order will for a will that wills the good. With that global second-order will in place, she is in a state of justification. And as I said at the beginning, if that faith is not impeded, if she doesn't slide back into resisting God's grace, the whole process will culminate eventually in her full integration around the good. It should be clear then that the most difficult and delicate part of the process of the salvation of human beings, the most difficult and delicate part of the process of reconciliation with God, is this initial surrender. Without this surrender, that process can't so much as get started. Even the omnipotent power of God is not able to produce the will of faith in a person without that surrender on her part, and yet God alone can't bring about that surrender in her. It depends ultimately on her. But sadly, for this one needful thing, for this surrender to God, any person in a post-fall condition will also have a powerful resistance to it. However tacit or hidden that resistance may be, however much it may be worthy of compassion more than justice, more than judgment, or more than punishment. So all human salvation is like a huge pyramid, balanced not on the head of a pin, but more nearly on the point of a pin. Without this one surrender in a human person's will, without this one small movement from a person's resistance to her quiescence in the will, a movement which God can't bring about, and which a post-fall human person doesn't want to bring about. Without this one small movement into quiescence, no human being can come into union with God. Without this crucial surrender, a person's psyche will slide more and more into an irrevocable loneliness whose source lies not in illness, poverty, or age, but only in the will itself. And so this surrender is as important as it is apparently out of reach for post-fall human persons. And here we come to the puzzle. And with this statement of the puzzle, I am done. So here's the puzzle. Here's the puzzle. It is at this point that we might finally look to Aquinas for some mention of the doctrine of the atonement. This is the place where one might expect to find some explanation of how Christ's passion and death are part of the remedy. But the way in which to connect this whole complicated, sophisticated, helpful account of justification with the passion and death of Christ, that is a really challenging issue. And it's one I'm only calling to your attention, but I am not going to discuss further here. So with that, I am done. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you for that wonderful paper, Professor Stump. Now, my allotted time for this response is relatively short, so please just allow me to get straight to it. In what follows, I offer a brief summary of the core of Professor Stump's interesting paper from today, insofar as I understood it, followed by an invitation for some clarifications, and lastly, two concerns, one on the nature of sin, and another about the ability of her model of a life in grace to accommodate certain marginally responsible agents. In her brief presentation this morning, Professor Stump developed a Thomistic take on the moment of justification, that is, the point at which an agent surrenders to the love of God, such that God infuses into her a higher order will for a will that wills the good. What is crucial for Professor Stump on this account, then, is to demonstrate first that an act of surrender is not a good human act, thus exonerating her from the accusation that her account is Pelagian. And second, that God's infusion of grace, that is, the infusion of a second-order will that wills the good, into a human person is consistent with that person exhibiting Professor Stump's brand of libertarian free will. In her abridged paper this morning, she directly addressed anti-Pelagianism, but did not have time to address the issue of freedom at great length. Allow me then to rehearse again the former and describe in brief the latter. First, with respect to Pelagian accusations, Professor Stump characterizes surrender as a sort of quiescence of will where an agent chooses neither for nor against divine grace. Importantly, it is not that such an agent makes a prior decision to enter into the state of quiescence, for such a prior decision would presumably be the human agent's own contribution of a good to the salvation process. Rather, the agent assumes a state of indecision, that is, a state which is not the actualizing of some capacity. It is instead precisely not to act. And in virtue of this passivity, we can rightly say that the agent does not contribute any good to the moment of justification. Hence, there's no Pelagianism. Second, with respect to worries about libertarian freedom, Professor Stump maintains that the Thomistic position, and this is from a longer version of the paper, she maintains that position that no will on which God acts with efficient causation is free in the relevant libertarian sense. To avoid the charge that God's infusion of grace counts as an instance of efficient causation, then Professor Stump claims that God simply infuses a new form into, rather than removes one from, a surrendering human agent. The divine form so infused results in a will of faith, a higher order desire for a will that wills the good, and it is both consistent with the will of the surrendering agent in service of preserving libertarian free will, and a positive good given the agent by God in service of avoiding grounds, again, for Pelagian criticism. On Aquinas' account, the infusion of a form or configuration around the good leaves intact the redeemed person's propensity to evil actions. In other words, for Professor Stump, Paul's words from Romans 7, I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep doing, seem particularly apt to characterize the person understood in her life of grace. These are the central features of Professor Stump's account needed for understanding the worries I'll raise momentarily. But first, I want to highlight some clarifications that at least I think would be helpful for Professor Stump to address. First, I'm sure there are those among us who, when they hear about an agent becoming quiescent in the will, they wonder, how psychologically plausible is such a story? And moreover, why should we not think of refraining from acting as the result of a prior decision to not act? In which case, the anti-Pelagianism of the account would be undermined. A second clarification that I think is worth our time is some explanation of how God's infusion of grace can rightly be said to be conditioned on something, namely surrender, for which a human agent has control and is thus responsible. If surrender is something out of the control of the agent, something, say, into which she retreats, then it appears that God's responding to such surrender with grace would not be a response to the agent, or as some might call it, a deep self of the agent, but rather a response to something else entirely. So, 2 clarifications. Now for some challenges. First, it's undoubtedly the case that chief amongst those things with which justification is meant to deal is a fallen human's propensity to moral evil. However, the biblical category of sin seems to include more than just questions of moral concern, or moral impurity, perhaps you might say. For instance, in Leviticus, we find laws prescribing sin offerings for agents who have unwittingly stepped on an animal carcass on their way to the temple. Such actions are sinful in the biblical context, but importantly, the offense is so delineated need not flow from a failure on the part of the offender's will to be sinful. How might your understanding, Professor Stump, of justification deal with sins such as these which do not appear to flow from any sort of deficiency in the will? Second, it strikes me that the occasion of quiescence of will or surrender upon which God infuses an agent with divine grace is still somewhat lacking. Perhaps I don't fully appreciate the nature of quiescence, but it seems to me that one might be caught in such a state for reasons that would prevent God's reasonably infusing that person with divine grace. Suppose that someone possesses a quiescent will in virtue of assuming a state of indecision where they are unable to choose either for or against God. If such indecision is the result of a struggle of moral reasons, that is where the agent struggles to choose due to internal moral conflict, then it seems fine for God to infuse them with divine grace. But suppose, on the other hand, that someone is in such a state of indecision for purely prudential reasons. They cannot choose for or against God because they cannot determine which choice would be more expedient. Or perhaps they never act for moral reasons in principle. For instance, some agents have a form of OCD known as scrupulosity, where they sometimes have destructive thoughts which are unconnected to their deep self or higher order desires. Suppose a scrupulous agent were committed to a life in a rejection of God, but that he was also commonly assaulted by thoughts of the love of God. That is, thoughts which, though not connected to his deep self, nevertheless left him unable to will for or against God for brief moments of time. Would an agent such as this, in this condition, be a candidate for justificatory grace? In addition, Consider an instance of someone who might become quiescent for purely prudential reasons. A psychopath might find himself stuck in a place of indecision between willing for or against God on the basis of prudential reasons, but most of us would find God's justifying an agent on this basis of quiescence, that is, quiescence resulting from the egoistic deliberations characterizing psychopathy, to be problematic. How might we think about such a case, or others involving various atypical agents? Now, I recognize that both of these challenges, the one on sin and the other on atypical agents, can be vexing in contexts other than a discussion of justification. Indeed, these are deeply complex issues, but these sorts of complex considerations are precisely the things with which Professor Stump is uncommonly well equipped to deal. So I look forward to learning from her thoughts on these questions.
So I will take just 1 minute, well, 2 or 3. I'm grateful to Dr. Rutledge for those very interesting remarks, clarifying and challenging remarks. And I want to say just a word or two about the issues, the clarificatory issues and the challenges. As he explains on the account I've argued for, a human person does no action which is an efficient cause of her being saved. What's attributable to her is only an omission, the omitting to continue to resist grace. So there's no Pelagianism here. Human being gets no credit for being saved. Nonetheless, it's open to her either to continue to resist grace or to omit to continue to resist grace. And when she does omit to resist grace, she can still at any time return to resisting it. It's up to her what she does. So she has alternative possibilities open to her, even apart from grace. On ordinary accounts, even of libertarian free will, she therefore has free will with regard to whether or not she omits to continue resisting grace. And if she has free will, she also has moral responsibility, and for that reason, she also has control. Consequently, although she does nothing to efficiently cause her being saved, she's nonetheless ultimately responsible for whether she's saved or not. It's her omission over which she has control, with regard to which she has free will, which is ultimately responsible for her being saved or not saved. So now we have the 3 elements we need for rejecting Pelagianism, but making all the credit for salvation be God's without being unable to answer the question, why doesn't God save everybody? That's the idea here. Now, so that's so much for the clarification. As for the challenge, Dr. Rutledge wonders, what about agents who move into this quiescent state for some reason having to do with expediency, for example? And I would say, in cases of that sort, as I hope the case of alcoholism, as I hope the issue of alcoholism helps you see, in such cases, the agent isn't in fact quiescent with regard to the central thing at issue. Alcoholics Anonymous supposes an alcoholic can't begin the process of recovery without surrender. But if an alcoholic should succeed in being quiescent in will as regards whether to be sober or not, if he succeeds in being quiescent as a ploy to get his family to leave him alone, he isn't in fact surrendering in the sense needed for recovery. His desires are still set against recovery from alcoholism. He's just trying to do something to get people off his back so he can stay alcoholic. So he wouldn't count as being quiescent with regard to the particular issue for which quiescence is needed. And finally, here's my last point, and then I'll sit down. As regards some of the things at issue in the laws in the Hebrew Bible, it seems to me very clear that there are things that can separate a person from God besides sin and guilt. Yeah. To take just one example, there's also shame. And some of the things mandated in the Hebrew Bible's laws seem to me, at any rate, clearly to have to do with issues involving shame. So shame is also something that needs a remedy. What I was talking about is guilt, but there is also at least another issue, and that's the issue of shame. But problems having to do with shame are much too large a topic to be dealt with in passing here. I've worked hard at them in other places, but for now, I'm just noting them and letting them go. So with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Do you want to stay standing for the Q&A? Okay, we've got some time for Q&A. We're going to go slightly longer because we started slightly later, but I'll make sure we cut things at 11:10. Please make sure that your questions are short and, dare I say, crisp. I do dare. And we've got a roving mic. Andrew's going to be doing the roving mic. So, questions? There's a question from Krista at the back.
Thank you so much for this. My question was, we talked about how once someone has had that quiescent state and then has the infusion of grace, there was talk about how that person could still go back to resisting grace. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how does that resistance come back once grace has been infused, and maybe even what's the role of the Holy Spirit? I know it's a big question, but I'm short.
Do I need the mic? So that's a good question. But think about it this way. A human person is, you might say, magistra over herself in virtue of having a will, an intellect and a will. That's part of the point of the tradition about how human beings are built. With the fall, part of the power is lost, and the part of the power that's lost is the part that involves willing the good. That's where the trouble comes in. But nothing about the rejection of Pelagianism implies that human beings lose the power to do evil. That power is always there, always there. So in whatever state you're in, the power to do evil remains with you, and you can exercise it as one of the powers that you've got. Just as you can open your eyes and look at something, you can exercise your power to will evil. Or as I hope the analogy with Alcoholics Anonymous will help illustrate, as recovering alcoholics are keenly aware, at any time, a recovering alcoholic can return to drinking. And if you want to know why, if what I've said already isn't enough, you have the power to do it. The choice is yours, you're master of yourself. If those answers are not enough, then I would say with Augustine, let no one seek to know from me what I know that I do not know. I mean, there's no cause of such a will. That's the whole point in saying that the will is free. So that's how I would answer that.
There's a question here from Sarah Cogley.
Eleanor, you said only very fleetingly something about desire. But desire is a category in Thomas that is very important in relationship to the will. And it also is very revealing for the relationship between sensual, bodily, and noetic capacities in Thomas. So particularly because of your illumination from Alcoholics Anonymous, could you clarify a bit more where desire fits in this vision of how we come to be justified?
Different people have different ways of understanding what a desire is and what the relationship is between a desire and an act of will. And I myself think it's helpful to think about desire and an act of will in this way. An act of will or a volition is a desire which is efficacious in being translated into action, provided that nothing outside the will interferes with it. So if we have something which is just a desire, we do not yet have a volition. The desire becomes a volition if it's efficacious. An inefficacious desire doesn't confer, as far as I read the tradition, an inefficacious desire does not confer moral goodness on the person who has that inefficacious desire, even if the inefficacious desire is for something good. So if you have someone who regularly beats his wife, and has no volition, not even a second-order volition, for a will that doesn't will to beat his wife, but has sort of an inefficacious desire that he'd be a better person than he is and wouldn't beat her, no one would think this inefficacious desire conferred moral goodness on him. It simply makes him pathetic. And that's the way I think about the connection between desire and volition in this general account.
Joanna Leitenhag.
Thank you. This, I think, dovetails on the last two questions quite well. In your account, surrender only seemed so far to apply to God, a human being surrendering to God. But it struck me that particularly with your really illuminating analogy to Alcoholics Anonymous, that often we are already slaves, right, to sin, and surrendered to other things in complex ways. And with that surrender comes resistance to God or resistance to healing or to those who wish to help us. So I'm just wondering if you could complexify your account a little bit insofar as we're already in some sort of state of surrender to the wrong things. And that therefore there might be something more like a movement and an actual act of the will in our surrender to God insofar as a rejection of those other things that have enslaved us. I think that just might complexify. I don't think it's contradicting your account, but I'm wondering if you would agree with that and how it would mesh with what you've said.
Well, complexifying is what I do best, so, so I am happy to do that. I think it's important to distinguish between surrender and submission. So suppose we have two characters, Jerome and Paula, and suppose that Jerome has submitted to Paula. Then this is Jerome's state. He wants what Paula wants him to want, because Paula wants him to want it. But that's compatible with his not wanting the thing in question, and it's also compatible with his hating Paula. So submission is very like what Aquinas calls servile faith. Aquinas says servile faith is a matter of getting yourself into a certain state because you're afraid of punishment. He's willing to count it as some kind of faith, more or less, but he thinks it just barely squeaks by, you might say. And that's because it's submission, not surrender. If Jerome surrenders to Paula, then what's happening is that he wants to bring his will and Paula's will into harmony because what he wants is Paula. So surrender carries with it a desire for a person, as I'm using that term, whereas submission doesn't carry that with it at all. It may carry fear of a person, but it doesn't carry desire for a person. So I would say that however you think those terms are best used, the distinction is clear enough. And for most of the things where we are enslaved, consider, for example, enslavement to alcohol, or pick your own favorite enslavement in your own life. In those cases, what we have is submission. So if you can't break your bad habit of what's it, it's not because the what's it brings you such pleasure that you need to go get it again. It's rather because avoiding the what's it brings you a kind of pain that you are unwilling to endure. To avoid the punishment of that pain, you continue in the thing which you hate. See what I mean? There's a wonderful place in Proverbs that goes sort of like this. It's also about alcohol, and the person in question says, I hate alcohol, it wrecks my life, it kills me, it does this, it does that, it wrecks my everything that I want to be, I will seek it again. And everybody understands that. I mean, there's no one who has failed to have experience of that kind of state. I will seek it again. And why? Because not to seek it brings with it a kind of intolerable, negative inner state, a kind of anguishing inner state that people feel unable to endure. So that's what I would say about those other enslavements. They're not surrenders, they're submissions in that state. And it's a rescue from the slavery of that kind of submission that the surrender offers.
Was there another question there, Andrew? Yeah.
Forgive me if I've misunderstood this conversation, but as best as I can understand it, we discussed Thomas' understanding of justification in which grace works upon the will in such a way that the will choosing the good is not itself Pelagian, which I think that's some of what you've said. But the question that I have is, if in kind of the spirit of Logos, we're bringing the conversation of modern biblical studies into this conversation, and we're saying Paul isn't a proto-Pelagian, or he's not arguing against Pelagianism in, for example, Galatians and Romans. That's not the issue that he's addressing. The question that I would have is then, how do we bring what you're saying about Aquinas into Paul's discussion of justification? Are they two separate conversations? And it's interesting to kind of pursue what Aquinas has said that exists apart from Paul, or is there the ways in which what Paul is arguing in Romans and Galatians actually influences the nature of the conversation? And so I'm just wondering if you could kind of bring Galatians and Romans, or one of the two, into conversation with Thomas and the freedom of the will.
Certainly the kind of freedom of the will that is rejected by Luther, for example, that kind of freedom of the will is also rejected by Aquinas. Because that's a freedom of the will where the will has the ability to choose either good or evil. And if you accept that kind of freedom of the will, you are Pelagian. And there is no Pelagianism in Aquinas. Now, the question that you raise is, what's the connection of any of this to Paul? And, I can't for the life of me figure out how to answer that very interesting question in half a heartbeat, but maybe this is the way to do it. So Aquinas is famous for saying at the start of his masterwork, Summa Theologiae, this book is an introductory textbook for beginners. And everybody laughs, you're kidding, it takes an expert to make your way through it and so on. Why would you think? But I myself think he means what he's talking about. He's generally taken to say that out of some sort of weird medieval need to express humility. But I myself think he means what he says. This is an introductory textbook for beginners. And so the question arises, what does he think the advanced work of his is? If that's the textbook for beginners, what's the advanced stuff? And I am convinced it's the biblical commentaries. A great part of his output is in biblical commentaries, and he has written biblical commentaries on virtually every epistle of Paul's. So he works, for example, consider Romans. He has a very powerful, deep, sophisticated discussion of Romans in which he feels he finds, authoritatively stated, the very view of justification which I have tried to outline here. But how to explain that or show that in a minute, I wouldn't have an idea. Yeah.
Chris Tilling, final question.
Hello. I worship in a church which is populated by a large number of people with severe developmental disabilities and mental disabilities, for whom the question of volition and quiescence and surrender can mean many different and complex things. And my question is this: to what extent is this account of grace, justification, and quiescence good news for them?
All these questions are lovely, and I like all of them, but that's my favorite one. So, remember what I said with respect to the question about submission and surrender. I said what you get in surrender is a desire for a person. So it's not a desire that there be such and such a state. It's a desire for a person. And you can know a person and have a desire for a person with very limited theological beliefs, with very wrong theological beliefs, with no theological beliefs. So here's my attempt to answer your question fast. I hope everybody will believe this is my attempt to answer it fast. So there was a point where my infant daughter had a very severe ear infection and my husband was gone. And the upshot of that situation was that I was so exhausted and had had so little sleep, I was desperate. And one of my philosophical colleagues, watching me drag myself around the department, said, "I'm going to come and babysit for you. I'll give you a good solid nap." I said, "You're on." Accepted. So he came to my house and I gave him instructions. I said, "Okay, she's in the back bedroom. She's quiet for a minute. I'm going to go sleep. She's quiet for a minute, but trust me, it's going to last just a minute. When she starts to cry and yell, pick her up, put her over your shoulder, pat her on the back, sing to her, talk to her, walk around with her." And he said to me, "Why?" I'm glad to hear some laughter. I thought it was an intelligence test. How do I explain to this male philosopher what I just said? He said, "She doesn't understand language. Why would I talk to her? She's not musical. She has no songs. So what difference does it make to her if I sing? Her ear is going to hurt her just the same, whether I pat her on the back and walk with her or I just leave her to scream by herself in the back bedroom. What difference does it make?" Yes, and I'm glad I'm hearing more laughter. The difference is this. Even a pre-linguistic, non-musical infant can know a person, can desire a person, can be consoled by a person. Nothing about even the absence of all those cognitive capacities can deprive a thing with a human nature from connection to a person. And if that story makes sense to you, then you can see how all the rest of the story will go about your question.
Please join me in thanking our speaker.